Picture this. You're walking through the streets of ancient Rome. The year is 2nd AD. The people go silent. All eyes turn to Emperor Nero, arrogant, adored, feared. Beside him walks a beautiful woman draped in gold and silk. But your chest tightens. Your heart fills with fury, because everyone knows the truth. That woman was once a teenage boy named Sporus, and what Nero did to him wasn't just cruel, it was violent, sick, and unforgivable. This is not just a story about power. It's a story about control, obsession, and one of the most disturbing, soul-crushing acts ever carried out by a Roman emperor. This isn't just a scandal. It's not a strange footnote in the long history of emperors and their excesses. It's something darker, something far more human. This is a psychological tragedy, because behind the marble columns and golden crowns, behind the power and politics, was a teenage boy whose body was taken, whose identity was erased, and whose soul was slowly crushed under the weight of another man's madness. His name was Sporus, and you may not know that name. History doesn't say much about him. There are no speeches recorded, no letters, no last words. He left behind no monuments, no children, no legacy of his own. But what he did leave, whether he chose to or not, was a story buried under the rubble of an empire. A story so disturbing, so raw, that even ancient Roman historians wrote about it with discomfort. This is not a tale of war or conquest. This is a tale of love, twisted into control, of grief, mutated by power, of obsession disguised as devotion. It's about an emperor who ruled over tens of millions and still couldn't control his own heart. A man who lost the one person he claimed to love and tried to bring her back through sheer force of will. A man so lost in grief, so broken by guilt, that he shattered someone else to rebuild what he had destroyed. And at the centre of it all was Sporus, just a boy, young, vulnerable, trusting. He didn't ask for power, he didn't seek the emperor's gaze. He wasn't a soldier or a politician or a player in the deadly game of Roman politics. He was simply there, wrong place, wrong face, wrong time. He looked like her. That's all it took, and from that moment on his life was no longer his own. He would be changed, cut, moulded, redressed, renamed, forced to play a role written by someone else in a performance he could never escape. You may not know Sporus now, but by the end of this story you won't forget him. Because what happened to him wasn't just strange, it was brutal. It wasn't just tragic, it was calculated. And it wasn't just history, it was a warning. A reminder that even in the most powerful places, among the richest and most worshipped men to ever live, there are still people who vanish, erased, silenced, broken, and sometimes the only way to bring them back is to tell their story. Nero became emperor when he was just 16 years old. At first, people were hopeful. The empire had known violence, fear, and unrest for too long. But Nero seemed different. Young, energetic, full of new ideas. He talked about peace, art, and beauty. And in the beginning, he followed through. He reduced taxes, gave money to the poor, put on plays and music for the people. He even stepped onto the stage himself, acting and singing for crowds who had never seen an emperor so open, so human. Many thought a golden age had begun. Rome was finally breathing again. For a time, Nero was loved. He gave the people what they wanted: entertainment, relief, something to believe in. But something inside him was already starting to change. Being emperor wasn't just about power. It was also about pressure. Every decision, every word, every whisper behind his back. Slowly, that pressure started to twist him. He became suspicious of the people around him, trusted fewer and fewer voices. Even his own advisors, the ones who had helped him rise, were pushed away or killed. He didn't want advice. He wanted control. Nero began to believe that he was special, chosen, not just to rule Rome, but to define it. He stopped listening. He stopped asking. Because in his world, no one could question him, no one could challenge him, no one could say no. He could never be contradicted, never be corrected, never be told he was wrong. And when you give a young man that kind of power, when you put a crown on his head and surround him with people who fear him more than they love him, something dark begins to grow. What once was kindness became pride, what once was passion became ego, and what once was art became obsession. The plays he once performed for fun became forced. He demanded applause, even if the audience was silent. He punished anyone who didn't praise him. He surrounded himself with flattery and ignored the truth. And slowly, Rome began to change with him. Fear crept back into the streets. Rumours of torture, secret executions, and burning buildings filled the city's whispers. People smiled when he passed, but not out of love anymore, out of fear. Nero was no longer the young boy full of promise. He was now a man alone in a palace of mirrors, seeing only what he wanted, hearing only what pleased him. And in that silence, surrounded by gold, marble, and false praise, he began to lose touch with reality. He was still emperor, still adored by many, still powerful beyond measure. But he was also something else now, isolated, suspicious, untouchable. And soon, this new Nero would find something, someone, that reminded him of the only thing he had ever truly loved. And he would try to bring it back, no matter the cost. Poppaea Sabina was not an ordinary woman. She was beautiful, striking even by Roman standards. People noticed her when she walked into a room. But it wasn't just her looks. Poppaea was smart, she understood people. She knew how to get what she wanted without raising her voice. She could read the mood of a room in seconds, and she always said exactly what needed to be said. She had been part of the royal court for years, slowly moving closer to the centre of power. And when she met Nero, she saw her chance. Not just for love, but for control, for influence, for the crown. At that time, Nero was already married to Octavia. Octavia was the daughter of the former emperor. Their marriage had been arranged when they were both teenagers. It was cold, distant, a marriage built on politics, not emotion. Nero and Octavia rarely spoke. There was no passion, no excitement, no connection. But Poppaea was everything Octavia wasn't. She was alive, confident, charming and bold. Where Octavia stayed quiet, Poppaea spoke her mind. Where Octavia avoided attention, Poppaea welcomed it. She became the centre of Nero's world almost overnight. Their affair began in secret, but it didn't stay hidden for long. The court gossiped. The people whispered, but Nero didn't care. He was falling afar, fast and hard, and Poppaea knew it. She gave him exactly what he craved: adoration, attention, and the feeling of being worshipped. She told him he was a genius, a god, a true artist. And Nero believed her. He started to change again. He stopped pretending to care about his first marriage. He began spending every waking hour with Poppaea. He gave her gifts, jewels, silks, perfumes, everything she desired. He painted her face on walls, carved her image in stone, and filled his palace with reminders of her. He wanted her close even when she wasn't there. But it wasn't just love, it was something deeper, something darker. He didn't just want to be with her. He wanted to own her, to shape her, to keep her forever. Poppaea to him became more than a woman. She became an idea, a symbol, the perfect companion, the flawless queen, and she knew it. Poppaea used her influence carefully. She placed her friends in powerful positions, she built alliances, she made herself untouchable. She wasn't just a lover, she was a player in the game of power, and she played it well. But there was danger in being that close to Nero. He was unstable, jealous, possessive. The same passion that lifted her up could easily turn against her. Still, for a time, Poppaea stood at the top of Rome's world. Adored by the emperor, feared by his court, worshipped like a goddess. She had everything: power, beauty, influence. But what she didn't know was that being Nero's greatest obsession also meant being his greatest weakness, and in Rome nothing stays beautiful for long. As Nero's love for Poppaea grew, so did his obsession. He no longer saw her as a partner or even a person. She became something more and something less. A symbol of beauty, a figure he could control. He began to reshape the world around her. He removed people from her life, friends, family, anyone who wasn't loyal to him. He surrounded her with servants who answered only to him. Guards followed her everywhere, not to protect her, but to watch her. Nero wanted to own every part of her life, every conversation, every moment. And Poppaea let him, for a while. But Poppaea wasn't weak. She wasn't afraid to speak her mind, even to the emperor. She had risen through Rome's most dangerous court by being smart and fearless. She knew how to use her influence, and she wasn't afraid to push back when Nero crossed a line. She challenged his ideas. She laughed at his bad performances. She questioned his choices. And Nero, now consumed by power, didn't like being questioned. Then came the moment that changed everything. Poppaea was pregnant again. It should have been a happy time. Nero had lost their first child, and now they had another chance. But the tension between them had grown. Nero was more unstable than ever, drifting between moods, chasing praise, avoiding reality. One day an argument broke out. No one knows for sure what started it. Some say it was about politics, others say it was jealousy. One version says she mocked him for being late to a chariot race. Another says she dared to suggest he wasn't being a good husband. Whatever the reason, something inside Nero snapped. He shouted. She shouted back. He stepped forward in anger, and then he struck her. Some sources say it was a single kick to the stomach. Others say it was a brutal, violent beating. What we know is this. Poppaea fell. She was bleeding, and she never got back up. The woman Nero claimed to love more than anything in the world was gone, killed by the same hands that once placed crowns on her head. She died carrying their unborn child, and just like that, the emperor who commanded armies, who ruled over millions, who was worshipped like a god, had destroyed the only thing he ever truly cared about. In that one act of rage, Nero crossed a line he could never return from. His grief was real, his pain was deep, but the damage was done. The woman who had lit up his world was gone, and in her place he was left with nothing but silence, regret, and madness. And yet he would not let go, because Nero was not done with Poppaea, not even in death. When Poppaea died, something inside Nero broke for good. He didn't act like a man who had just lost his wife. He acted like a man who couldn't accept she was gone. He refused the normal Roman rituals for death. Cremation was tradition, ashes, urns, closure. But Nero couldn't bear the thought of her body being burned. He gave a new order instead. She would be embalmed. Her body was cleaned, stuffed with spices, and wrapped in fine cloth. A tomb was built for her, larger and richer than most emperors, covered in gold, decorated with flowers, protected by guards. He called it a temple, not a tomb. But that wasn't enough. He didn't want people to mourn her. He wanted them to act like she was still alive. And so, the court obeyed. They spoke her name in the present tense. They left her seat empty at royal banquets. They bowed when entering rooms where she used to sit. They placed fresh flowers by her bed. They smiled, nodded, and pretended, because to do anything else was dangerous. Nero would talk to her body for hours, whispering to her cold, unmoving face, telling her about his day, asking for advice, waiting for answers that would never come. Some said he kissed her lips, powdered her face, kept her body close in secret chambers. Whether that's true or not, one thing is certain. Nero was no longer just grieving. He was living in a fantasy. He didn't just miss Poppaea, he needed her. And when she was taken from him, he didn't let her go. He held on to the idea of her. He tried to bring her back through rituals, through memory, through force. And the longer this went on, the deeper his madness grew. He ordered statues of her to be built across the empire. Not just in Rome, in Greece, in Egypt, in every major city. Shrines were raised in her honor. Priests were paid to worship her as a goddess. Songs were written, poems recited, sacrifices made. Poppaea had become something new. No longer a wife, no longer a woman. Now she was a symbol, a divine, perfect being who never aged, never spoke back, never left. But underneath all that worship was guilt. A guilt so heavy it crushed everything in its path. Because Nero knew what he had done, and no temple, no statue, no sweet-smelling perfume could erase the truth. He had killed her. He who ruled the world had destroyed the one person he truly loved. And now, surrounded by her image, her voice in his mind, her presence in every room, he couldn't tell what was real anymore. His grief had turned into delusion, and his mind, once full of music, theatre and vision, was now consumed by one endless, impossible thought. What if she could come back? And then he saw Sporus. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a senator, he wasn't a nobleman, he was just a boy, young, quiet, and almost invisible. His name was Sporus. He was around 14 or 15 years old, born into slavery, raised inside the walls of the palace. His job wasn't glamorous. He served, he listened, he obeyed. But Nero had a habit of taking interest in those close by. And in time, Sporus was freed, given clothes, education, and a small place in court life. He had no idea what was coming. One day, Nero saw him, really saw him, and something inside the emperor clicked. It wasn't the way Sporus spoke. It wasn't anything he said or did. It was his face, the shape of his eyes, the softness of his features, the slight curve of his cheekbones. It reminded Nero of someone he couldn't forget. Poppaea. At first, it was just a glance, then a second, then a stare that lasted too long. Ancient Romans believed that physical resemblance wasn't just about looks. They believed it meant something deeper, a spiritual link, a kind of fate. To look like someone was to carry a part of them inside you. And to Nero, that belief became reality. He didn't see a boy standing in front of him. He saw her, the woman he had loved, the woman he had lost, the one he had buried in gold and roses and silence, the one he still talked to in the dark hours of the night. And now, in this boy's face, he saw a second chance. Not to move on, but to go back. Not to heal, but to rewrite the past. In that moment, Sporus stopped being himself. He became something else. A blank canvas, a shadow, a reflection. Nero didn't see the fear in the boy's eyes. He didn't hear the silence in his voice. He didn't care about who Sporus was, what he wanted, or where he came from. He saw what he wanted to see, and in his broken, deluded mind, this was a gift, a miracle, a sign from the gods. Poppaea had returned, or at least she could, and so the decision was made. Nero wouldn't just bring Sporus close, and he would reshape him, rebuild him, erase him. He would turn this boy into a living version of the woman he had destroyed. It wouldn't matter what Sporus wanted. It wouldn't matter what it cost, because Nero was no longer mourning. He was creating, or so he thought. And Sporus was no longer seen as human. He was now the emperor's project, his fantasy, his second chance, and what came next would change Sporus's life forever. Nero had made up his mind. He wasn't going to just admire Sporus from a distance, and he wasn't going to let the boy live his own life. He was going to turn him into Poppaea, completely. And it began with the most brutal order of all. Nero summoned his physicians and told them what he wanted. Sporus was to be changed permanently. He was to be castrated. In ancient Rome, this was no careful procedure. There was no clean surgery, no anesthesia, no safety. It was painful, crude, and dangerous. Many boys died during the process. Some bled out, others died of infection. But Nero didn't care. His command was law, and it was carried out. Sporus, just a teenager, was held down by guards as doctors obeyed the emperor's wishes. The pain must have been beyond imagination. His cries would have echoed through stone walls, but no one stopped it. No one dared. And once it was done, he was no longer just Sporus. He was given a new name, Sabina. The same name Nero had once called Poppaea in private. From that point forward, everything about Sporus's life changed. He was moved to special quarters in the palace, rooms decorated like a queen's chambers, walls lined with silks, floors covered in soft rugs, mirrors placed everywhere. Imperial dressmakers began designing clothes for him, gowns that softened his frame, hid the lines of his body, and created the shape Nero wanted to see. Jewelers crafted earrings, bracelets, and necklaces using stones that had once belonged to Poppaea herself. Makeup artists came next. They taught him how to apply powders and paints, how to widen his eyes, redden his cheeks, soften the edges of his face. They gave him a new face day after day, a painted mask. But the transformation didn't stop there. Voice coaches were brought in. They taught him to speak in a higher pitch, to laugh more softly, to pronounce words like a Roman lady. Tutors trained him in movement, how to walk with smaller steps, how to sit with folded hands, how to tilt his head, blink slowly, smile at just the right moment. He was shown how to carry himself like a woman, not because he chose to, but because Nero demanded it. Every part of Sporus's life became a performance. Every hour of his day was spent acting, pretending, surviving. He looked into mirrors and saw someone else, not a boy, not himself, but a stranger wearing the face of a dead woman. And deep down he must have known. He could never go back. Not after this. The name Sporus was fading. The person he had been was disappearing. And in his place stood Sabina, a role he never asked for, a mask he could never take off, a life written by someone else's grief. Then came the unthinkable. Nero, Emperor of Rome, made an announcement that left even his closest advisors stunned. He was going to marry Sporus, not adopt him, not keep him quietly in the palace, not let time erase his obsession. He wanted a full official imperial wedding. The preparations were massive. The largest hall in the palace was decorated from floor to ceiling. Thousands of oil lamps lit the walls. Musicians were summoned from across the empire. Perfumes were poured into the air until the entire room smelled of roses and spice. No expense was spared. Not a single corner was left untouched. They smiled. They clapped. They offered gifts and congratulations because they had no choice. But behind the polished words and forced smiles was fear and horror, because everyone knew what they were looking at. There, standing beside the most powerful man in the world, wearing a gown of gold and a crown meant for a queen, was a teenage boy, paraded as the dead empress. Sporus stood somewhat, dressed like Poppaea, moved like her, named after her. He said the vows, held Nero's hand, and played the part perfectly. The ceremony followed every tradition. Vows were exchanged. Sacred bread was broken. Legal documents were signed, sealing the union under Roman law. And with that, it was done. Sporus was now officially Nero's wife, the Empress of Rome. He was given his own quarters in the palace, lavish, filled with silks and servants. He had his own attendants, his own guards, his own budget drawn directly from the emperor's treasury. He was escorted in a litter during public processions, followed by musicians and flower-bearers. People bowed to him, called him Sabina, treated him like royalty, but none of it was real, because it wasn't a love story, it wasn't romance, it was a performance, a fantasy, a twisted illusion created by a man who could not face the truth. And for Sporus, it was a prison made not of chains, but of velvet, perfume and lies. He was surrounded by luxury, but had no freedom, given titles but no voice, worshipped but never seen for who he truly was. Every moment of every day he had to play the role, smile when he wanted to scream, bow when he wanted to run, be Poppaea when he had never even known her. The wedding wasn't a celebration, it was a funeral in disguise, a final goodbye to the boy he had once been, and the beginning of a life where nothing belonged to him. Not his name, not his face, not even his future. He was now Nero's creation, a symbol of grief, a shadow of the past, and a prisoner in a palace too beautiful to escape. After the wedding, Nero did not slow down. He didn't hide his strange new union. In fact, he showed it off. He travelled across the empire with Sporus by his side, introducing him to governors, kings, and foreign guests, not as a servant or companion, but as the Empress of Rome. And no one dared question it. They bowed, they smiled, they gave gifts. They spoke to Sporus as if he were Poppaea herself, and Sporus played along because he had no choice. When Nero visited Greece to perform in festivals and show off his so-called art, Sporus was there, dressed in silks, covered in jewels, carried in a litter, followed by musicians and slaves. He sat beside Nero in public, stood behind him during ceremonies, smiled during dinners, but all the while he was playing a role built on someone else's life. Nero would speak to him as if he were Poppaea, recalling moments they had never shared. Do you remember that night in Alexandria? Wasn't that music lovely, like when we danced in the garden? And Sporus would nod, smile, respond, pretend to remember a past that wasn't his. He had to, because if he didn't, it could cost him everything. So he became good at it. He learned what to say, when to laugh, when to stay silent. He read Nero's moods like weather, knew when a single wrong word could trigger anger or worse. To the outside world he was graceful, quiet, obedient, a perfect empress, but inside something was fading. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw someone he didn't recognize. Every day he woke up in a world that wasn't his, wearing clothes that weren't his, living memories that weren't his. He was no longer a person, he was a performance, a statue brought to life, not by magic, but by madness. He became emotionally hollow, empty, a shell walking beside the most powerful man in the world. And perhaps the cruelest part, he had never even met Poppaea. He didn't know her voice, her smile, her touch, but every part of his life now belonged to her memory. He wasn't Sporus anymore. He wasn't Sabina. He was something else entirely, a ghost of someone he never knew, a soul trapped in another's legend. And with each passing day that legend grew heavier. No matter how perfectly he played the role, it was never enough. Because he wasn't real, not to Nero, not to Rome, not to anyone. He had been erased, replaced, and reshaped into the shadow of a dead woman. And in the silence of gold-lined halls, surrounded by mirrors and perfume, he must have wondered, who am I, when nothing of me is left? By 68 AD, Rome had had enough. Nero's madness, his greed, his vanity, it had finally gone too far. Governors rebelled. Armies turned against him. The Senate declared him an enemy of the state. His world collapsed, and as his empire fell apart, Nero ran. He fled the city with a small group of loyal followers, and among them was Sporus. Even with death closing in, Nero couldn't leave behind the one person who looked like Poppaea. Even in his final days, he needed the illusion. He needed the mask. They hid in a small villa outside Rome, waiting, hoping. Nero swung between wild escape plans and quiet despair. He talked of fleeing to the east, of rebuilding his throne, but deep down he knew it was over. When soldiers finally closed in, Nero chose death. He pressed a dagger to his throat and ended his life, alone, afraid and broken. With Nero gone, Sporus was no longer protected. He was no longer Sabina, no longer a queen. He was just a boy again. But the world didn't forget what he had become, and those who came to power next didn't see him as a victim. They saw him as a prize. He was passed from man to man, claimed by one emperor, then another. Each treated him the same way Nero had, not as a person, but as property, a reminder of power, a living trophy. They dressed him in women's clothes, called him Poppaea, forced him to relive the same nightmare again and again. But the worst was yet to come. Under the rule of Emperor Vitellius, a plan was made. One so cruel it broke whatever was left of Sporus' spirit. He was to be brought into the Colosseum. In front of a crowd of thousands, he would be dressed as a bride. And in a twisted comedy, he would be raped, publicly, by an actor playing the god Pluto, ruler of the underworld. It was not entertainment, it was punishment. It was degradation on a level no human should ever face. And so, Sporus made the only choice that was truly his. He found poison, and he drank it. He died quietly before the performance could begin. He was probably no more than 20 years old. And in that final act, his first act of freedom, he ended the story others had written for him. For once, no one chose for him. No emperor, no court, no crowd, and he chose silence. He chose escape. And in doing so, he refused to be used one more time. He had lived as a shadow. He had suffered as a symbol. But in the end, he died as himself. We remember emperors. We remember their victories, their palaces, their statues carved in marble. We remember their wars, their armies, their crowns. But sometimes the stories that matter most are the ones that were never supposed to be told. The ones that were buried, forgotten, silenced. Sporus' name should be remembered. Not as a footnote, not as a curiosity, but as a symbol of what happens when love turns into control, when grief becomes obsession, when power loses all limits and a person becomes a possession. He was just a boy and he didn't choose any of it. He didn't ask to be seen, and yet he was turned into a doll, a shadow, a reflection of someone he never even knew. They took his name, his body and his identity and his future. They erased him in life. But in death, he left behind something they couldn't take. A story. And it's our job to remember it. And if you want to join us as we continue exploring the hidden, painful and powerful truths of history, make sure to subscribe. And I'd love to hear from you. So leave a comment below and tell me, what part of Sporus' story stayed with you the most? Was it Nero's obsession, the wedding, the transformation, the ending? What made you feel something?